Good evening. Most who know even a cursory amount of the chronicled Bigfoot offerings realize that the more modern Bigfoot craze began in 1957 with the discovery of giant footprints at a road construction site near Bluff Creek, California. The release of this story on the AP wire, coining the term Bigfoot, created quite a stir and just about guaranteed its place in modern 20th century pop culture. How interesting it was to also learn that the Hoopa Indians from Northern California had claimed to already know about this giant they called Oma, or Boss of the Woods. The beast had been long known to them for centuries, and it was amusing to the members of the tribe to watch the white man's reactions to the discovery of the footprints. And this wasn't the first time anyone had heard Native Americans talk about the creature. Interestingly enough, the name Sasquatch was coined by Canadian journalist J.W. Burns back in the 1920s, who heard about it from the natives in British Columbia. But the fact is that earlier accounts of white settlers, trappers, and prospectors coming across these giant beasts were far more numerous than anyone could have imagined at the time. Mostly these tales were relegated to the local newspapers or related to diaries or letters for very few to see. After all, no one wanted to be labeled a crackpot, and that kind of thing just wasn't talked about back in the days of forced detentions into insane asylums. But some stories leaked out one way or the other. Take, for example, the report of hunters from Portlock, Alaska, found mutilated back in 1949. Giant man-like tracks, 18 inches in length, were reportedly seen closing in on moose tracks, and then signs of a struggle near to the hunters' bodies. Although moose tracks were seen nearby, no moose was found. Only the signs of the large human-like footprints leading away from the area to higher ground. This hadn't been the only case of strange happenings there. Several times hunters had gone off, never to return, and in at least one instance, mutilated body parts had come downstream into the bay. The villagers packed up and left the town of Portlock in 1949, not wanting to have anything further to do with the beast they called Urayuli, or Bushman. One interesting story from 1947 made it from the local paper at Penny Ridge, Missouri, all the way to the Los Angeles Examiner. This was a case involving a small group of hunters who came across a Sasquatch that was killing some sheep and goats. Hunting dogs that were sent after it were killed. A man by the name of Glenn Payne went after it later on with his pack of hunting dogs, and all of them were killed too. Payne's Jeep was overturned by the creature before the Sasquatch ran off. The point is that there are literally hundreds of events reported prior to 1958. One of the first known written accounts of such a creature in Western America dates back to 1811 and appears in the journal of one David Thompson, surveyor and trader for the Northwest Company of Canada, who came across huge, human-like footprints near the present site of Jasper, Alberta. In his journal he made the following entry. Continuing our journey, in the afternoon we came on the tracks of a large animal. The snow about 6 inches deep on the ice. I measured it, 4 large toes of 4 inches in length, to each a short claw. The ball of the foot sunk 3 inches lower than the toes. The hinder part of the foot did not mark well. The length 14 inches by 8 inches in breadth, walking from north to south, and having passed about 6 hours. We were in no humor to follow him. Its great size was not that of a bear. But accounts from the eastern United States appeared soon thereafter. In fact, the oldest North American newspaper account appeared in the Exeter Watchman of New York on September 22, 1818. The item reported the sighting of a wild man of the woods near Ellisburg, New York, on August 30th of that year. Now, the creature was said to bend forward when running, to be hairy, and to leave footprints showing a narrow heel with spreading toes. Beginning in 1834 in Arkansas, a giant wild man was seen by many people in the Ozarks. The Memphis Examiner reported on one of the later Arkansas sightings in March of 1850, noting, quote, "This singular creature has long been known traditionally in St. Francis, Greene, and Poinsett counties, Arkansas sportsmen and hunters having described him so long as 17 years hence." Unquote. The wild man was said to be of gigantic stature, and the description matched that of your typical Bigfoot. Not so typical were Bigfoot reports where violence had occurred. In 1847, another explorer, Paul Kane, made the point that the native Indians appeared to be frightened of a race of beings that lived up in the woods. His entry for March 27th reads, quote, "When we arrived at the mouth of the Kettle Poodle River, 26 miles from Vancouver, Washington, I stopped to make a sketch of the volcano Mount St. Helens, distance, I suppose, about 30 to 40 miles. This mountain has never been visited by either whites or Indians. The latter assert that it is inhabited by a race of beings of a different species who are cannibals and who they hold in great dread. These superstitions are taken from a man they say went into the mountains with another and escaped the fate of his companion, who was eaten by the skookums, or evil giants. I offered a considerable bribe to any Indian who would accompany me in this exploration, but could not find one hardy enough to venture there." Unquote. Now, the notion of Bigfoot being a cannibal is not widely accepted, but does exist. The Kwakwaka'wakw, believe it or not, it's Kwakwaka'wakw tribe of British Columbia tell about the wild woman of the woods, or Snakwa, that's also called the cannibal woman and used as kind of a boogeyman character who will steal children and eat them. And there is also the eastern Athabascans who report tales of the Wendigo, or wicked cannibal. In the 1890s, near the Chetco River in southern Oregon, a dozen loggers and their families encountered a great beast with disastrous results. Camping in tents by the river, the lumbermen would awake each morning to find logs scattered about like matchsticks and huge human footprints left in the damp earth around the camp. One night the loggers were awakened by shrill screams of something not quite human in the near underbrush, so taking a rifle, one man lit a torch and headed into the darkness. He was quickly followed by several other men. It wasn't long before the first man rushed back to the others, babbling incoherently about a hairy monster 8 feet tall. The next night, upon hearing more sounds from the woods, 2 other men decided to track and kill the hairy intruder. With rifles in hand, they disappeared into the darkness of the woods while the others stayed in camp. After a while, those in camp heard screams and shrieks and the sounds of gunfire, followed by silence. When the 2 men did not reappear, the other loggers took lanterns and torches, and while firing their guns into the air, set out in search of their comrades. A half-mile from camp, they found the scene of a desperate struggle. Broken and bleeding arms and legs ripped from their bodies, their 2 friends lay scattered all over the place. They had been slammed against trees and torn into pieces by something with incredible strength. Blood dripped into small pools from branches high in the trees, as well as from the crushed greenery of the surrounding shrubs. As to the hairy creature responsible, there were only bloody footprints leading deep into the woods. The loggers struck camp and left the area the next day. Professional hunters entered the forest in the days that followed, but found no sign of the creature. Now compare that story, which happened in Oregon, with another similar story that occurred on the opposite side of the country in the state of Maine. Some of the first sightings there was in the mid-1800s around Mount Katahdin, Moosehead Lake region, and 6 encounters with man-like giants the natives called Pamula had been reported. The source of these reports came from a book entitled Camping Out by C.A. Stevens, and is said to be Mr. Stevens' diary. The book was published in 1873 by the John C. Winston Company of Pennsylvania. In his book, he mentions the death of a trapper years before. The man had been found ripped apart, and at the time it was thought to have been a mountain lion that had done this. The problem that some had with this was that many bones had been broken, and it appeared that the trapper had been picked up and beaten against a large tree. A later news article from Bangor, Maine, 1895. Great consternation caused by the deeds of a wild man. Unlucky lumbermen slain and their bodies mangled in a shocking manner. November 26th. A lumberman who returned today from the forest in the north of the state brings the most harrowing intelligence of the doings of a wild man in the lumber region of the West Branch. He states that great consternation has been caused, and a large number of lumbermen have left the camps and returned to their cities rather than face the monster. For over 2 months, quite a number of men had disappeared from the camps, and when found bore a semblance of having had an encounter with some wild animal, their bodies in every instance having been terribly mangled and torn. One lumberman who returned to a camp a little north of this city a week ago startled all by stating that while at work he had been attacked by this wild man, and it was only by the help of his axe that he had been able to defend himself from the murderous attack. Since that time the monster had been seen by the crews several times, but on their approach he fled into the deep woods with the speed of a deer. He is described as being so nearly like an animal that it is almost impossible to detect him for one. Now, without getting into the vast amount of historical accounts from all around the world, here is just a few notable ones that demonstrate just how far back they can go. The first written account of the North American wild man occurred in 986 AD, when Leif Erikson and his men landed in the New World. In Samuel Eliot Morrison's account of the Norse voyages, Erikson mentions creatures they called skellrings, which were, quote, horribly ugly, hairy, swarthy, and with big black eyes, unquote. And Germany has its share of old tales about hairy giants. This wood carving, dated from the 15th century, is tied to a lengthy tale entitled Fight in the Forest, that recounts, whether fictional or not, the story of one knight's brush with the Bigfoot-type beast. And here is another wood carving from the Dark Ages, depicting the rescue of one fair maiden from a hairy giant. But the majority of these accounts, I can safely say, have historically been here. I am amazed at the widespread Native American tales of these creatures from all corners of the American continent, and surprised at how so very much alike these stories and descriptions are. In just about every tribe I have looked at, they all have stories of these beasts, and they are told in a way that indicates them as not being of spirits or myth, but as being a recognized creature of the woods. Generally, tribes maintain a localized identity with separate traditions, customs, and stories that reflects the things they are familiar with. The only similarities could be from common animals known to many different tribes. They all may have different stories about the wolf or the eagle, for example, and may even call them by different names. But they are still animals that are easily recognized by most tribes. So the fact that the majority of tribes know of a Bigfoot-like animal I find very intriguing. Even more intriguing are the amounts of cave paintings and masks and totem carvings and even stone carvings that seemingly depicts Bigfoots. In the 1920s, many stone carvings were found near to burial grounds along the Columbia River in Oregon State. The carvings look to be of ape-like heads that date anywhere from around 500 to 2,500 years ago. How any American native could know about apes prior to the 1800s and on another continent defies logic. Now, I'm not trying to suggest that old stories are evidence for the existence of Bigfoot, nor am I suggesting that the tales were fact rather than fantasy. My intent here has been simply to demonstrate how the history of Bigfoot is widespread, extends well into the distant past, and exists in abundance. This is Super Soylent, and thank you for watching.